you guys here know the story of the Marlowe brothers? The town of Marlowe is named after the Marlowe outlaws. Well, there's a strong Erin Springs connection. And this story is new, because I'm telling everything from the perspective of Erin Springs. I'm not telling it from Marlowe. So there was a guy who lived here, I think it was in 1886. His name was Alexander Frank Morris. Now, I don't know who he was. I wasn't able to find any history on him, but I do know this. He was a fiddle player. He could play the fiddle till the cows came home, and everybody around here looked for entertainment. There wasn't much to do except for drink Kill Me Quick whiskey and punch cattle. And so Frank Morris had a dance here one night. People came from all around. And of course, what happened when people come from all around and they get a little Kill Me Quick whiskey? Well, it ended up being in the court papers, right? Somebody got in trouble. But in the court papers, they list everybody who was here in 1886. And so that's very helpful. Now, another point of orientation. You guys know where Parr was? No?
Where, who?
Parr. Rush Springs. Okay, just not quite where the next book I write is going to be about Parr, because I've already found it too. Very interesting thing, very interesting place. Anyway, so these people all come in here, and they're dancing and carrying on and drinking, and the fella who brought the liquor seems to be a guy named Lambert. And pretty soon they had a whole bunch of people here, and their wives and their girlfriends and their sisters, and a man named George Harbolt came from Erin Springs to where he lived about 8 miles that way on Roaring Creek. George Harbolt was described as considerably drunk when the dance began to wind down around midnight. As Morris began fiddling the last set, word spread that the ladies were preparing to depart. Well, George Harbolt took a big exception to that and said if any of them left, he was going to kill them all. Well, Morris jumped up and said, "No, you're not." And George Harbolt pulled out his pistol, and I don't know what he was going to do, kill all the ladies, kill Frank Morris, but anyway, wound up shooting Morris in the hand. The shot went right through his hand, hit Morris's poor wife in the leg. Well, Morris was hurt, but he got the pistol away from Harbolt and knocked him in the head with it, and he fell down cold cocked, and that was the end of it. But things like that never ended, because sooner or later, Heck Thomas came along, U.S. Deputy Marshal Heck Thomas, and Mr. Morris complained to him, said, "Oh, George Harbolt came over here from Parr and shot me in the hand." And he said, "Well, what'd you do?" And he said, "Well, I took his pistol away from him and cold cocked him." He said, "Well, since you committed assault on George Harbolt, he better have shot you in the hand." None of these, there is not a single story in my book about where somebody got convicted. Everybody either gets off, or people lie and they get off, or the president pardons them. Every single person in this book, no one went to jail. Except for one stupid guy named George Isaacs who lived over by Chickasha. But that's it. I mean, we're talking about, there's 50, half a hundred outlaws in this book, and nobody got in trouble because it was Indian territory. Let me tell you a little bit about George Harbolt. He was born around 1860 in Sherman, Texas, and he was one of 5 sons and a daughter born to James and Nancy Thornhill Harbolt. And if you don't hear a mini-series in these names, I swear. The Harbolt clan could never stay on the right side of the law. And it wasn't too long, and probably in the early 1880s, that they disappeared into Indian territory. You see, people could do that back then. There wasn't no law here. So you could do as you pleased. I mean, if you crossed Frank Murray, and Heck Thomas wasn't nowhere around, Frank Murray'd shoot you and kill you. And they'd bury your body over by the springs. The Harbolts were friends, associates, well-known associates of the infamous Marlowe brothers, and their story is an interesting one too. They lived near the present-day town of Marlowe in Stevens County, and the John Wayne movie, as you probably know, The Sons of Katie Elder, was reportedly based in part on the tribulations of these poor Marlowe brothers. Their names were George, Charlie, Alf, Boone, and Ep. Well, around a month after the incident in Erin Springs, George Harbolt and George Marlowe, apparently friends, were charged on February 20th, 1886 with, guess what? Introducing spirituous liquors into the Indian country. Harbolt was arrested by Heck Thomas, and at his home between Erin Springs and the Par Post Office out here. And several of the people who had been at the dance here were witnesses against him. Well, he actually went to jail, but not for very long. I mean, I think these people took a trip to Fort Smith, sat in jail for a week, and then came home. Most students of Central Oklahoma history know the story of the Marlowe brothers. The same year that George was charged with violating the liquor laws, all 5 of the Marlowe brothers, and I do not know if these guys were outlaws or saints, but this is their story.
They were
outlaws or saints. All 5 of them were charged, were accused of stealing horses in Colorado at a time when only George was there. Don't ask me how that happened. They were all jailed, and they were still in jail in October of 1888, and they were all indicted on additional charges of stealing horses from 3 Indians. Now, they were in jail when this happened, from 3 Indians near Fort Sill who never confirmed the thefts. All the brothers were eventually released on bail to await trial, and that includes Boone Marlowe. Well, back in 1885, Boone Marlowe, the next to the youngest, had shot and killed a cowboy at Vernon, Texas. He was supposedly self-defense, as were all shootings in Indian Territory at the time. Boone bailed out of jail in December 1888 and returned to the family home, and at the time the Marlowe brothers lived near Graham, Texas. Well, lawmen came to arrest him for the old murder, right? And when one of the deputies shot at him, he returned fire, and he shot the county sheriff. The sheriff soon died, and Boone became a wanted man. So what do you think he did? He fled to Indian Territory. Well, as it turned out, Boone Marlowe had an old sweetheart right over here on Roaring Creek. And that's where he hid out with George Harbolt's sister. Now, the 4 remaining Marlowe brothers were again rounded up after Boone shot the sheriff, jailed and arrested and jailed, this time on charges that they were somehow involved in the sheriff's murder. Now, maybe you can explain it, but I don't get it because they weren't there. But anyway, they escaped the next day, but they were recaptured immediately. Now, Texas was no stranger to vigilante justice. And 3 days after the 4 Marlowe brothers were safely incarcerated again, a mob of locals attacked them in their jail cell at night. Now, if you've ever, I mean, this is extreme stuff. But, so the authorities had to move the Marlowe brothers to another place just to keep them safe. When they took off with them, they were attacked again by another vigilante mob, and the boys were all shackled at the ankle. So they somehow got a hold of some weapons when they were attacked by this vigilante mob. And I suppose that it's true, but Alf and Ep were killed. George was forced to cut the feet off of his dead brothers to free himself and Charlie from the shackles. The thing is in the end, like everybody else in this story, they were acquitted. They went to Colorado, and guess what they became? Famous lawmen. Back here in Indian Territory, it's a different story. Before Boone even left Texas, people knew there was a price on his head. And when he got back over here to where he could continue to spark George Harbolt's sister, there was already a manhunt on for him. So in January 1889, he was hiding on Hell Roaring Creek, not too far from Erin Springs, near the home of Sally Harbolt. George obviously had been released from jail at Fort Smith for liquor charges because he was back, and he soon became aware that there was a $1,500 reward for the return, dead or alive, of Boone Marlowe. Well, there's no honor among ruffians. Despite the Harbolt family's long-standing ties to the Marlowes, George Harbolt conspired to kill Boone Marlowe for the reward money. Many years later, a man named Ed Abrams claimed that his father, Kansas Perry Abrams, an early Marlowe settler, knew the circumstances of Boone Marlowe's death. Here's his story. George Harbolt didn't have the guts to shoot Boone Marlowe because he was afraid of him. So he poisoned him. He carried Boone's lunch to him one day. It was supposed to have strychnine in it. After eating, Boone said, "George, I'm sick as hell. I need a cigarette." Boone smoked a cigarette, and it wasn't long until he kicked out. George then set him up against the stump and shot him in the head. He threw Boone's body into an open hack and took him to Texas to claim the reward. There was just one problem with this story. As Harbolt and company made their way to Graham, Texas, a doctor who had known Boone Marlowe for years was called upon to identify the body. This doctor closely examined the corpse and concluded it was likely that Boone had been poisoned before he was shot. Don't ask me how he did that in 1889. The doctor's opinion did not make it back to Graham before Harbolt and company got an award for killing Boone Marlowe. But it seems it was fair game to shoot a wanted man, but not to poison him. Authorities were not long in correcting their error, and on January 28, 1889, Head Marshal again wrote from the Parr Post Office in Indian Territory requesting an arrest warrant for George Harbolt and his accomplices. They were quickly arrested and taken to Dallas, Texas. One man where Harbolt was charged with accessory to murder. Don't ask me why he got off on accessory. But anyway, each of the defendants was released on $5,000 bond during the March 1889 court at Graham, Texas. But prosecution was not pursued because we didn't hunt down outlaws in Indian Territory. We took them into our house and set them on our sofa. But the thing here is that supposedly prosecution was not pursued because George Harbolt was shot to death a short while later. But George Harbolt wasn't shot to death. He didn't die, and he was never called to answer for his transgressions. He married Lizzie Beavers in 1889, and he went on to have at least 6 children. By 1900, the Harbolt family continued to live in the vicinity of Marlowe. By 1910, they had moved to the tiny community of Cross in Grady County and were living in Lindsay, just north of Erin Springs, by 1920. George Harbolt lived to be 92 years of age, and he is buried beside his wife in the Marlowe Cemetery, a graveyard that takes its name from the family of a man George helped murder so many years ago.